This can't be right. It is exactly right.
You forged this!
Read it and see.
This document outlines the forfeiture of all assets. Your family's claim is now invalid.
We have the legal authority.
The inheritance belongs to me. The reading is complete.
Now, the future begins.
She came alone, and that was the first mistake everyone thought they understood. Evelyn Carter stood at the entrance of the Pierce family estate hall, the heavy double doors closing softly behind her as if sealing her into a space where she did not belong. The room ahead was luminous with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the quiet confidence of old money gathered in one place. Conversations dipped for a fraction of a second as eyes turned toward her, then quickly resumed as if she were an unimportant detail in the background. No one approached her. No one smiled. She adjusted her simple black coat, not because she was cold, but because it was the only thing she could hold onto in a room that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. At the center of the gathering stood the Pierce family, already forming clusters that spoke in low, controlled tones about inheritance, legacy, and the formal reading of a will that had brought them all together. Jonathan Pierce noticed her first, leaning slightly toward his mother with a faint smirk that suggested recognition mixed with disbelief. Margaret Pierce followed his gaze, her expression tightening just enough to signal judgment without needing words. Evelyn did not move closer to anyone. She remained near the edge of the room, where the light from the chandeliers faded slightly and the noise of the crowd softened into a distant hum. Her presence there was not accidental, but no one in the room seemed willing to consider why she had been invited, or if she had been invited at all. A waiter passed by offering drinks, and even he hesitated briefly before continuing past her as though unsure whether she belonged on his list of guests. Daniel Brooks, seated near the main table, whispered something that caused a few nearby guests to suppress small, dismissive smiles. The atmosphere did not turn hostile in any obvious way, but instead settled into something more subtle, a shared assumption that Evelyn Carter was out of place and would soon reveal herself as irrelevant. She kept her gaze forward, not meeting anyone's eyes, as if she had already decided that acknowledgement from them was unnecessary. Somewhere, deeper in the room, the sound of paper being organized could be heard, the quiet preparation of legal documents waiting for the moment they would be spoken aloud. Evelyn exhaled slowly, steady and controlled, as if preparing for something only she understood. She did not look nervous. She did not look confident either. She simply looked present, and that presence alone seemed to unsettle a few of the people who had already decided who she was before she had even spoken. No one in that room knew that the story they thought they were watching had already begun long before she arrived, and no one yet understood that her being alone was not a sign of absence, but a sign that something important was already in motion. The room gradually settled into a structured silence as more guests arrived and took their assigned places, forming a clear hierarchy that Evelyn Carter could feel without anyone needing to explain it. At the front of the hall, a long polished table had been arranged with precision, reserved for the Pierce family and their closest advisors, while the remaining guests occupied rows of chairs positioned like an audience waiting for a performance they believed they already understood. Evelyn remained standing near the outer edge of the gathering, her position unchanged, as if the space itself had quietly assigned her a place far from importance. Jonathan Pierce continued speaking in a low voice with a cousin seated beside him, occasionally glancing toward her with a look that mixed curiosity and dismissal, as though trying to determine whether her presence was a mistake or a forgotten obligation. Margaret Pierce sat with perfect posture, her hands folded neatly, her attention shifting between the entrance and the legal documents resting in a sealed folder at the center of the table. The atmosphere carried the weight of expectation, not grief or celebration, but anticipation of financial transition, where every person in the room was silently calculating their own future position. Evelyn did not participate in any of these calculations. She simply observed, her expression steady, her attention occasionally shifting toward the sealed folder as if it held meaning that others had not yet recognized. Daniel Brooks leaned back in his chair and spoke quietly to another relative, his words causing a subtle ripple of amusement among those nearby, reinforcing an unspoken agreement that Evelyn Carter did not belong in their circle of influence. No one asked her to sit. No one offered her acknowledgement beyond brief glances that quickly moved away. Even the staff moving through the room adjusted their paths slightly to avoid disrupting the invisible boundary that had formed around her. The legal assistant, Sophie Lane, entered quietly through a side door, carrying additional documents and briefly scanning the room before taking her position near the main table, her expression professional but alert. Shortly after, Richard Hale appeared, and the change in energy was immediate. Conversations lowered further, chairs shifted slightly, and attention gradually converged toward the front. He carried himself with deliberate control, holding a sealed envelope that seemed unremarkable in appearance yet drew focus from everyone present. Evelyn's gaze followed him, not with urgency, but with quiet recognition, as if she had been expecting this exact moment long before it arrived. Jonathan Pierce straightened slightly in his seat, his earlier confidence returning as he exchanged a brief glance with his mother, both appearing reassured by the structure of the room and the familiar presence of legal authority. Richard Hale placed the envelope carefully on the table without opening it, allowing the silence to deepen around it. It was at that moment that the subtle dynamics of the room began to shift, though no one fully understood why. Evelyn remained still at the edge of the space, her presence unchanged, but the attention of the room had begun to drift toward the object at the center of the table, as if it had quietly replaced every other point of focus. The silence in the room became more structured as Richard Hale stepped fully into position behind the table, placing both hands briefly on the polished surface as if grounding the moment before it began. Every conversation had now stopped completely, leaving only the faint sound of movement from the staff adjusting their positions along the walls. Evelyn Carter remained at the edge of the room, unchanged in posture, but her attention had fully aligned with the sealed envelope resting in front of the lawyer. Jonathan Pierce shifted slightly in his chair, leaning forward with a controlled expression that suggested confidence, as if he believed the outcome of the moment had already been determined long before this gathering ever took place. Margaret Pierce maintained her composed posture, her eyes fixed on Richard Hale with the calm assurance of someone accustomed to being in control of legal and financial transitions. Daniel Brooks exchanged a brief glance with another relative and allowed a small, restrained smile to appear, as though anticipating an outcome that would confirm their assumptions rather than challenge them. Sophie Lane stood quietly to the side, holding additional documents and observing the room with professional detachment, her focus occasionally returning to Evelyn Carter as if noting something that others had overlooked. Richard Hale opened a small folder beside the envelope, reviewing a final set of notes before speaking, and the anticipation in the room tightened further, creating a pressure that seemed to concentrate around the center of the table. He did not rush. Instead, he allowed the silence to deepen naturally, ensuring that every person in the room was fully aware of the weight of what was about to happen. Evelyn did not move closer, but her stillness carried a different quality now, less like distance and more like certainty. Jonathan Pierce finally spoke in a low tone, directing a comment toward his mother that carried a hint of impatience, suggesting that the process should proceed without delay. Margaret responded with a slight nod, reinforcing the expectation that order and structure would soon be restored. Richard Hale then placed his attention directly on the sealed envelope, his expression neutral but focused, and the atmosphere shifted again, subtly but unmistakably, as if the room had collectively recognized that the next action would define everything that followed. Evelyn Carter's presence at the edge of the space no longer felt like an afterthought to the room, even though no one had explicitly acknowledged her. Instead, attention began to drift toward her in brief, unintentional moments, as if people were beginning to question the simplicity of the assumptions they had made earlier. The sealed envelope remained untouched for a final second longer, and in that suspended moment, the entire room appeared to be waiting for permission to understand something they had not yet been told. Richard Hale finally broke the silence by lifting the sealed envelope with deliberate precision, holding it at eye level for a brief moment as if confirming its authenticity before proceeding. The room tightened instantly, every gaze locking onto his movement, while the faint sound of shifting fabric and restrained breathing became the only indicators of life within the otherwise frozen atmosphere. Evelyn Carter remained at the far edge of the room, her posture unchanged. Yet her attention sharpened with quiet focus as though she had already accepted the significance of what was about to be revealed. Jonathan Pierce leaned slightly forward, his earlier confidence now replaced with a more controlled anticipation, his hands resting firmly on the table as he prepared for what he assumed would confirm his expectations. Margaret Pierce maintained her composed expression, though her eyes narrowed slightly, suggesting a deeper level of calculation beneath her calm exterior. Daniel Brooks adjusted his seating position, exchanging a brief glance with another relative, both appearing to brace for a moment that they believed would validate their assumptions about inheritance and control. Richard Hale placed the envelope back down on the table, then carefully slid a document out, aligning it with precision before speaking. His voice was steady and professional, carrying across the silent room without effort, as he began to read the formal introduction of the legal testament. Each word seemed to slow time, drawing attention deeper into the structure of authority that the document represented. Evelyn did not react outwardly, yet there was a subtle shift in how she held herself, as if the content being read was not surprising but instead long expected. Jonathan Pierce exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible smile with Margaret, interpreting the formal tone as confirmation of their assumed position within the family structure. Sophie Lane, standing slightly behind Richard Hale, observed carefully, her eyes moving between the document and Evelyn Carter with increasing attention, as though she was tracking details that others had not yet recognized. The lawyer continued reading, maintaining a controlled pace, ensuring every sentence was clearly understood by all present. As he progressed, the tone in the room began to shift in ways that were not immediately obvious but increasingly noticeable in body language and silence. Conversations of confidence earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by a growing focus on each word spoken. Evelyn Carter remained the only figure not engaged in visible reaction, standing at the periphery of the gathering like a fixed point in a room that was beginning to lose its assumptions. The sealed envelope now lay open on the table, its contents partially revealed, and although no single moment had yet altered the room completely, an underlying tension suggested that the structure everyone believed in was about to change in a way none of them were prepared for. Richard Hale continued reading the document in a steady, controlled voice, each sentence measured with legal precision, while the atmosphere in the room began to shift in ways that were subtle at first but increasingly impossible to ignore. Evelyn Carter remained still at the edge of the gathering, her gaze fixed forward, not on the people around her but on the lawyer and the document he held, as if she was listening for something specific beneath the formal language. Jonathan Pierce's earlier confidence began to soften, replaced by a more focused expression as he leaned in slightly, trying to catch every detail being spoken, while still maintaining the appearance of control in front of the others. Margaret Pierce adjusted her posture almost imperceptibly, her hands tightening together for a brief moment before returning to a composed position, suggesting that the contents were beginning to require more attention than she had initially expected. Daniel Brooks, who had earlier displayed quiet amusement, now sat more rigidly, his eyes narrowing slightly as the reading progressed beyond standard formalities and into clauses that carried unexpected weight. Sophie Lane, standing just behind the lawyer, followed each line carefully, her expression becoming more attentive as she tracked both the document and the reactions forming around the room. Richard Hale paused briefly, turning a page with deliberate care, and the pause itself seemed to stretch the silence even further, causing several guests to shift uncomfortably in their seats. When he resumed, his tone remained professional, but the structure of the content began to change, moving from general statements into more specific declarations that subtly altered the tone of the gathering. Evelyn Carter's expression remained unchanged, yet her stillness now felt different, not passive but anchored, as if she already understood the direction of what was being revealed. Jonathan Pierce exchanged a brief glance with Margaret, his brows tightening slightly as the wording being read no longer aligned as cleanly with his expectations as before. A few guests in the background leaned closer together, whispering in low voices that quickly faded under the authority of the lawyer's voice. Richard Hale continued without interruption, now introducing a section that referenced names and conditions tied directly to inheritance distribution. And at this point the room's energy shifted noticeably from passive attention to active uncertainty. The earlier confidence that had filled the space was gradually replaced by a quiet tension, as if people were recalculating assumptions in real time. Evelyn Carter remained the only figure whose posture did not change, standing at the same distance, neither approaching nor retreating, as the legal reality being spoken began to reshape the understanding of everyone else in the room. The document in Richard Hale's hands now felt less like a formality and more like a turning point, though no one yet fully understood in which direction it would turn. The reading continued without interruption, but the tone in the room had already shifted into a state of heightened uncertainty, where every word from Richard Hale seemed to carry more weight than the last. Evelyn Carter remained positioned at the edge of the gathering, her stillness unchanged. Yet the way she observed the unfolding details suggested a quiet awareness that contrasted with the growing restlessness around her. Jonathan Pierce, who had previously appeared composed, now showed subtle signs of strain in his posture, his attention locked on the lawyer as the language of the document moved deeper into specific allocations and formal declarations. Margaret Pierce maintained her outward composure, but her gaze had become more fixed, her expression tightening slightly as sections of the text began to reference structural details that appeared more complex than expected. Daniel Brooks no longer displayed any sign of amusement, instead leaning forward slightly, as if attempting to anticipate what would come next, while maintaining a careful silence. Sophie Lane continued to monitor both the document and the reactions in the room, her attention shifting between the legal language and Evelyn Carter with increasing focus, as though noting an emerging pattern that others were not yet acknowledging. Richard Hale turned another page with deliberate precision, pausing briefly before continuing, and in that pause, the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. When he resumed, his voice introduced a clause that changed the atmosphere significantly, referencing conditions tied to specific individuals in ways that subtly disrupted the assumptions held by the audience. Jonathan Pierce straightened slightly, his eyes narrowing as he processed the implications of what was being read, while Margaret Pierce's expression shifted for the first time into visible concern, though still controlled. A faint murmur passed through a few of the seated guests, quickly suppressed as they refocused on the lawyer's words. Evelyn Carter did not react outwardly, but the quiet focus in her eyes suggested that she was following every detail with complete understanding, unlike the uncertainty spreading through the rest of the room. Richard Hale continued steadily, now approaching the section that appeared to define final distributions, and the pacing of his reading slowed slightly, as if emphasizing the importance of what was being revealed. The sealed nature of the document's authority had now transformed into something active and immediate, altering the emotional structure of the gathering. People who had earlier appeared confident were now visibly recalibrating their expectations, while those who had been dismissive began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Evelyn Carter remained the only figure unaffected in visible demeanor, standing at the same distance, neither stepping forward nor retreating, as the legal truth being spoken began to reshape the entire understanding of the room without yet revealing its final consequence. Richard Hale's voice slowed even further as he reached the section of the document that carried the highest level of legal authority, and the atmosphere in the room tightened as if every person present understood that the next few lines would determine the direction of everything that followed. Evelyn Carter remained at the edge of the gathering, her posture unchanged, yet her attention now appeared fully anchored to the lawyer, as though she was hearing confirmation rather than discovery. Jonathan Pierce leaned forward slightly more than before, his expression now fully focused, the earlier confidence replaced by a measured seriousness as the wording being read began to diverge from what he had clearly anticipated. Margaret Pierce's composure remained intact, but her eyes had narrowed noticeably, and her hands, once still, now rested more firmly against each other, signaling a shift from passive listening to active evaluation. Daniel Brooks no longer exchanged glances or subtle reactions. Instead, he sat rigidly, his full attention locked onto the document as the structure of inheritance distribution became increasingly specific and unexpected. Sophie Lane's focus sharpened as she tracked both the legal language and the subtle reactions in the room, her gaze occasionally returning to Evelyn Carter with a quiet intensity that suggested she was connecting details others had not yet processed. Richard Hale turned another page and paused for a moment longer than before, allowing the silence to expand naturally across the room. And in that silence, several guests adjusted their posture almost unconsciously, as if bracing for something they could not yet define. When he resumed speaking, the tone of the document shifted into definitive declarations, naming specific conditions and responsibilities that altered the assumed hierarchy within the estate distribution. Jonathan Pierce's expression tightened as he absorbed the implications, and Margaret Pierce's calm exterior began to show faint signs of strain, though she remained silent and composed. A few guests in the background leaned closer together, whispering briefly before falling silent again, as the legal authority in the room seemed to suppress all informal reaction. Evelyn Carter did not move or react outwardly, yet her presence now felt less like distance and more like alignment with what was being read, as if she had already accepted the outcome long before it was spoken. Richard Hale continued with steady control, his voice now carrying a finality that made each sentence feel irreversible, and the room collectively sensed that the document was approaching its most critical revelation. The earlier confidence that had filled the Pierce family gathering had now fully dissolved into uncertainty, replaced by a careful silence where every individual was recalculating their position. Evelyn Carter remained the only figure whose stillness did not shift, standing at the edge of the room as the legal truth moved steadily toward its final turning point, without yet revealing the full consequence that would soon redefine everything they believed about ownership, inheritance, and belonging. Richard Hale reached a point in the document where the structure of the reading changed again, and the shift was immediate enough that even the smallest movements in the room became noticeable. Evelyn Carter remained at the edge of the gathering, her expression unchanged, but her focus now appeared absolute, as if she was listening not for surprise, but for confirmation of something already known. Jonathan Pierce sat completely still, his earlier confidence now replaced by a restrained tension in his posture. His attention locked onto every word as the legal language began to define outcomes rather than possibilities. Margaret Pierce maintained her composed appearance, but her gaze had become more fixed and analytical, suggesting that she was now fully processing implications that extended beyond what had been initially assumed. Daniel Brooks no longer showed any signs of distraction or side conversations. Instead, his full attention remained on the lawyer, his expression tightening slightly as the final structure of the estate began to take shape in unmistakable detail. Sophie Lane stood quietly beside the table, her eyes moving carefully between the document and the reactions forming across the room, her professional focus now sharpened by the increasing complexity of what was being revealed. Richard Hale paused once more, longer than before, allowing the silence to settle completely over the room, and in that silence, the sense of anticipation reached its highest point. When he spoke again, his voice carried a clear and definitive tone, signaling that the final sections of the document were now being addressed. The wording became precise, identifying specific conditions tied directly to inheritance authority, and as each clause was read, the structure of assumed control within the Pierce family began to weaken visibly. Jonathan Pierce shifted slightly in his seat, his expression tightening as the implications of the language became unavoidable, while Margaret Pierce's composed exterior showed a faint but unmistakable change, as if the certainty she had held was beginning to fracture under the weight of formal declaration. A few guests in the background exchanged brief glances, their earlier confidence replaced by quiet uncertainty, and the room as a whole seemed to hold itself in a suspended state of attention. Evelyn Carter remained completely still, positioned at the edge of the space, yet her presence now carried a sense of alignment with the unfolding legal reality, as though the reading was not revealing something new to her but instead confirming a position she had already accepted. Richard Hale continued without hesitation, his voice steady and controlled, as he approached the final segment of the document, where the distribution and authority were being explicitly defined. The emotional structure of the room had now fully shifted from expectation to anticipation of irreversible clarity, and every person present appeared to understand that whatever was about to be stated would finalize not only the legal matter but also the balance of power within the entire gathering. Evelyn Carter did not move, speak, or react outwardly, yet in that moment she stood as the only constant in a room where every assumption was on the verge of being permanently rewritten. Richard Hale finished the final section of the document in a steady voice, and the moment the last formal clause was spoken, The entire room fell into a deeper silence that felt heavier than anything that had come before it. No one moved immediately, as if the confirmation of what had just been stated required time to fully register in the minds of everyone present. Evelyn Carter remained at the edge of the gathering, her posture unchanged, but the stillness around her now carried a different meaning, as though the conclusion of the reading had quietly repositioned her within the space without her taking a single step. Jonathan Pierce sat frozen for a brief moment, his expression no longer confident or analytical, but visibly unsettled as the legal reality settled into place. Margaret Pierce maintained her composed appearance, yet the subtle tension in her face revealed that the final terms had not aligned with her expectations, and she remained silent as she processed the implications. Daniel Brooks no longer displayed any hint of earlier dismissiveness. Instead, he sat rigidly, his attention fixed on the lawyer as if searching for clarification that would not come. Sophie Lane lowered her gaze briefly to the document, then looked toward Evelyn Carter with a quiet seriousness, as though confirming something she had suspected but had not spoken aloud. Richard Hale closed the document carefully, placing it back inside the sealed folder with deliberate precision, signaling that the reading had officially concluded. For a brief moment, no one in the room reacted, and the silence extended in a way that felt complete and final. Then, slowly, subtle movements began to emerge, as guests shifted in their seats and exchanged uncertain glances, attempting to reconcile what they had just heard with what they had previously believed. Jonathan Pierce finally leaned back slightly, his earlier confidence fully absent, replaced by a restrained silence that suggested disbelief rather than acceptance. Margaret Pierce remained still, her expression controlled, but the absence of immediate response from her side reinforced the significance of what had been revealed. Evelyn Carter did not move forward or speak, yet the focus of the room had quietly drifted toward her, not through announcement, but through recognition that could no longer be avoided. The lawyer stepped back from the table, maintaining professional composure, while the sealed envelope lay closed, no longer an object of anticipation but a symbol of conclusion. The gathering that had begun with assumptions of hierarchy and certainty had now shifted into a space of recalibration, where every person present was forced to reassess their understanding of value, ownership, and position. Evelyn Carter remained alone at the edge, unchanged in expression, but no longer unseen, as the reality established by the document had fully redefined her presence within the room without the need for a single spoken declaration from her side.
Take a moment to think about, what does this story really mean? How often do we decide who someone is before we hear their story? Sometimes the quiet person carries the greatest strength, and the one who is everyone overlooked is the one who can change everything. The Pierce family believe wealth, status, and appearance define a person's worth. But the truth proved otherwise. Character never measured by money or reputation. It is revealed by what's inside their heart and how they treat the others when life